Last week, 4 of the teens charged in the beating death of a Rancho high school student were sent from adult court down to juvenile court, and the reactions have been intense. Victim Jonathan Lewis's mom has very publicly said this isn't justice. And this isn't the only recent Las Vegas case where high school-age kids are being tried as adults. Today on CityCast Las Vegas, we speak with Professor Eve Hanan from the UNLV Boyd School of Law. She's worked for a long time around the juvenile justice system and explains why some juveniles get charged as adults and if Las Vegas's approach is fair or failing. It's Wednesday, September 11th. I'm David Figler, and here's what Las Vegas is talking about. The way that these cases have been framed in the media often hinges on one big question. Do we call these teenage defendants children or juveniles or kids or youths? So, Professor Hanan, what language do you use to refer to people under the age of 18 in these situations?
Hi, David. Thank you so much for that question. And please call me Eve during this conversation that we're having today.
Well, that's good since we're neighbors and we also are friends. So yes, right, I will call you Eve.
So I tend to use the word youth or adolescence because I think that's what really fits with what we've learned over the last couple decades about juvenile brains and brain science, which has made it all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court in terms of thinking about why youth or adolescents and children are different than adults. And David, I think, as you know, the real issue is this question of blameworthiness and rehabilitation and how we think about adolescence. So an adolescent is somebody whose brain is not completely developed. And over the last 20 years, we've got a better view, like a literal view of their brains through MRI and other imaging where we can see that their brains are really different. And that's informed the law. That's changed the way we think about kids in court.
But, that brain development, as I understand it, lasts all the way up till the age of 25. Are we saying people under 25 should be considered adolescents now, too?
True. Some people are based on brain development. But, this is where science meets law, and law absorbs science slowly over time. And as you've said, there are really competing concerns and competing interests in these cases. Like this case we're talking about today, this is a very serious crime. And so it's understandable when the family of the victim who's going through such enormous pain, it's really something that's hard to fathom for those of us who haven't been through it, wants something that they think of as justice. What would happen to an adult who did this? It's understandable that they would want that. But the question for the youth is, what's justice for them given their age, given their development, and where they are in their lives as well?
Yeah, we've had a couple of these high-profile cases recently. The one from Rancho High School, also the cyclist hit-and-run death charged as first-degree murder from last summer, 2023. Rancho student Jonathan Lewis died as a result of blunt force trauma after being in a fight with at least 9 individuals. It was all caught on video. It went viral. All of those 9 were charged. 4 of them went to adult court. The other 5 went to juvenile court from the start. How do those type of decisions get made in Nevada, which court to go to?
So every state has a system for deciding who goes to juvenile court and under which circumstances a kid, a youth, can be tried as an adult in criminal court with other adults, people who were over 18. In Nevada, when the child is 16 or older, so we're talking about that 16, 17 range, and you have a crime like a homicide, this case is going to go to criminal court. I call it adult court sometimes, but I guess we should probably just call it criminal court, where adults are tried. For younger teens or children even, some of these kids who were involved were 13, 14 years old. Their case is going to start in juvenile court. And in some cases, if it's a serious crime, if there are other factors, some of these cases can go up to the criminal court. But the really important thing to understand about the difference between the juvenile court and criminal court is a huge difference in the kind of punishment or penalties that can apply to the person.
Yeah, and we hear a lot about these penalties. I'm wondering, how does the decision get made? I know if they're over 16 and it's a serious crime like murder, there's an automatic certification to the criminal court. And for the others, it's discretionary. How is the decision made whether or not those, I guess, 14 to 16-year-olds charged with serious crimes go to the criminal court?
Well, it is discretionary, but this is really something that is initiated in the district attorney's office.
Hmm.
These are decisions made there, and it's a bit of a black box. I was actually just talking to another legal researcher who's in a different part of the country saying, she was saying that she would love to do a study where she just looked at how decisions are made by district attorneys across the country about whether to proceed in juvenile court or whether to try or ask the courts to try kids as adults. So
Hmm.
she's interested in looking at this because it's very discretionary in the sense that it's really up to the district attorney. And then, depending on the type of case, it may be that the court has a larger or smaller role in it.
What is the policy reason behind taking kids as young as 14 and putting them into the adult system?
That is a great question, David, because it is unusual. The policy, let me start this over again here on
That's
that
okay.
one.
I like the part where you told me it was a great question, though, Eve.
Well,
It's a
for
big
over,
question.
yeah.
Yeah.
So for over 100 years, we have had juvenile courts. We've had this acknowledgement that kids are different. In the 1980s and in the 1990s, when we went through our first real tough on crime wave, there were some high profile incidents, and some of them were similar to what we're seeing here, which caused a massive wave of, I would say it was a crime scare, of fear that there were juveniles who were sometimes called super predators, which we know is a pretty racially coded term now, and we've
Mm.
disavowed. But they were talking about kids who were not kids. They were so dangerous, you couldn't even consider them as other children or as other adolescents, and they needed something that would stop them from committing crimes long into the future, long past when the juvenile courts could intervene. So that was a real movement in the 80s and 90s, and it led to a lot of legislation, which in turn led to more kids being prosecuted in criminal courts and being sentenced sometimes to death, as in Roper and other cases, and sometimes life in prison or sentences that would go on for decades. So that's something that's a bit more recent, and it's part of a tough on crime mentality. And the idea behind it is that there's some kids who it's decided at the outset are not really children in the sense that we think that they'll rehabilitate and they'll change over time.
Yeah. I mean, the super predator language, these aren't kids, these are monsters sort of narrative really does seem to resonate with a segment of our society, probably fostering some of those harsher laws, even those in Nevada, to come into existence. Why do you think that resonates so much? Is it borne out factually that there are these kind of young people who only the adult system would work for?
It is not borne out factually. Or let's say this way, you can't tell with a young person who they're going to be in 10 years or 20 years. So what is the information that the person is going on who says, lock up a child forever or send them to criminal court to face possible life, 20-year sentences, whatever it is? What's behind that is this idea of the crime, just looking at what happened, and it may be horrific. And if the crime is horrific, then the feeling is this child shouldn't be treated as a child
Right. I
anymore.
mean, we hear that.
Yeah,
Do the
right.
adult crime, do the adult time, things like that.
Yeah,
So,
but there's no real basis for it in developmental psychology or in developmental neuroscience. You will not find anybody in developmental neuroscience or psychology saying that. They're going to say, we can't tell who kids are going to be. And that's why there's a lot of controversy among mental health professionals about whether or not a kid could be diagnosed with a personality disorder, because they say, we don't know who this child is yet. We don't know who even a late adolescent will grow up to be.
Now, talking about the Rancho High School matter, it just got resolved with the four youths who went to adult court, coming back to juvenile court to admit to voluntary manslaughter, and where they can be under the jurisdiction of the juvenile court theoretically until they're 21 years old. Um, the mom of the victim here, Jonathan Lewis's mom, said that this isn't justice and was quoted as saying, literally, no one is being held accountable. Here's a big question: justice or accountability? Is she right?
Well, David, as a law professor, I'm not going to say yes or no. I'm going to say it depends.
I wasn't expecting you to, but I want to hear what you have to say about that. I mean, she's saying that there's no justice here, there's no accountability.
Absolutely. Right. So I think that what she is referring to is the fact that in juvenile court, they lose any jurisdiction over those kids at age 21 at the latest.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas in the criminal system, it could be decades or life, depending on what they're charged with, what charges stick, and so forth. So that gulf in there, when you tell that parent who's lost a child that the person or the people who did this are going to be free in a couple years, that might not feel like justice to her. And I think we can understand that perspective, but then also say, what obligation does the state have? What obligation do we have to everyone involved? And what do we really offer the victims and the families of victims other than to say that a person will go to prison? Are other services, are other opportunities being offered to this family to heal
what
from
kind of
this?
opportunities are you talking about that aren't being offered that maybe should be?
Well, David, I'm not sure what it would look like, but I do know, and as you know, I have a background as a public defender, and I believe strongly in treating kids as kids and not as adults. At the same time, when I hear a parent like this who has lost a child, I wonder what kind of support and communication she's getting from the state. She is saying that she's not being kept in the loop. I don't know. I know the DA's office said that they have kept her in the loop and told her at each stage what would happen. But I don't know what kind of support systems are offered. So in Baltimore, where at the University of Baltimore Law School, I helped to develop a juvenile justice project to work with juvenile lifers. We saw that the DA's office and victim services had multiple events throughout the years and counseling programs and services, especially for the families of homicide victims. I don't know what's being offered here, but it was very robust there. I'm not saying that's enough. I'm not saying that's justice, but something like that might get at some of these other needs that are there for families who've gone through such a great tragedy.
Well, I mean, I hear the term slap on the wrist when some people talk about the juvenile justice system, especially compared to, the heinousness of the crime. I mean, here you had at least 9 kids, different roles, sure, but the end result was the same, is that's the death of a young person. I could completely understand why some people think that it's just not sufficient. I mean, are there times when it does make sense to try an adult in a juvenile court and give them the maximum punishment for society to feel like fairness has been doled out?
So a case like this to me is like a classic youth case when we look at what the developmental science says. You've got a group of kids. It's hot thinking, not cold thinking. It's the moment they're in. There are peers there. They're doing what their peers are doing. It's hard to even tell who's doing what, right? So there's this group think happening. And they're kids who individually, we don't know what they would do or what they wouldn't do. So in a sense, it's kind of like a classic juvenile thing. It's not a sort of planned out, organized thing done after reflection, right? So if you take it in that context then, and then you think about like, what is juvenile court for? Well, juvenile court is to rehabilitate. Juvenile court is to provide state intervention to help somebody who's on the wrong path, who's committed crimes, even serious crimes, which we call delinquent acts, not crimes for kids, help that person get on the right track. So is it a slap on the wrist? Well, juvenile court doesn't say, here is the punishment you deserve for what you did. Juvenile court says, what can we do so that this young person doesn't grow up to commit crimes, to get them on the right track and to hold them accountable without that lifetime of punishment that we might give to an adult in the same situation.
But Eve, are there any times at all when even to you it makes sense to try a juvenile in adult court?
Well, David, I think that kids are kids, and my position is one of humility about who kids will turn out to be, because we really don't know what that person is going to be like when they grow up. Okay, here's the other problem, though. What about a person who seems like they're still really dangerous and they're 21 years old and they're out of the jurisdiction of the juvenile court?
Mm-hmm.
There's a huge gulf between saying, we're going to keep track of this person until they're 21 and saying this person's going to prison for decades. And the fact that there's nothing in between those two options, I think that's why we see some of these conflicts and dismay, like you see from the victim's mother in this situation.
I mean, changing gears to the other high-profile criminal activity allegedly done by juveniles in the last year, you've got these two kids who are purported to be driving around looking for bicyclists to topple over. And, understandably, in the toppling of a bicyclist from a vehicle, you wind up with a death on your hands. I mean, that seemed very plotted, very intentional. People don't seem to be very upset that they are being tried as adults, and their trial is coming up this November. They also seem to show no remorse. I mean, all these factors, you understand that this is why people clamor for more adult court treatment, right?
I completely understand why people see, especially older teens who commit intentional acts which can harm or kill others. I completely understand why people want to try them as adults. That doesn't mean that that's what we should do, or that makes sense with either the science or international norms or what might be fair for that young person. But let's talk about this a little bit here in terms of policies and other policies that could be in place.
Yeah.
In Maryland, once a 16-year-old gets their driver's license, there's a restriction on it. They can't ride with another young person, another teenager. They could, except to take a sibling to school or something like that. Why that is because if you put two teens in a car together, you get risk-taking.
That's
behavior they would never do alone.
We're both teens. We know where that comes from.
Yeah. Now, is that the same thing as what we're talking about here? Intentionally targeting bicyclists? No, absolutely it's not the same. But do we know whether or not these two young people, either one of them would have done this if they weren't with the other one and getting juiced up on that feeling of being together and doing something, egging each other on? We don't know. I don't know the facts of the case, so I don't want to say one way or the other. But yeah. I mean, the science just says that kids are different. Like, you can look at the fMRI of a boy who's 18 years old, 16 years old. I know 18 will try as an adult anyway by the legal definition, but you can look at the fMRI of a 16-year-old and you can identify their brain out of a lineup of adult brains, right?
Yeah.
Because the frontal lobe is not developed, which is where they would make their decisions, their executive functioning. The white matter hasn't covered everything, so parts of the brain are not talking to each other the way they will later. They're just not the same person they're going to be later on. And that's the concern, and that's where I hesitate. The crimes are horrible. I don't mean to say they're not. And juvenile court does not reflect the seriousness of some of those crimes. It's meant to reflect the youthfulness of the person, of the offender.
Mm. Well, you do talk about a gulf between this juvenile justice system that we have now and the much harsher punishments and sentencing of the adult criminal court. So what is an objective measure of justice or accountability as that question comes up in our community?
Wow, you're asking some really easy questions here, David. I've figured out what justice is.
That's why I went to the associate dean of the law school. I'm not messing around.
To be clear, I'm one of many associate deans.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so oftentimes when people say justice, they mean that they want somebody to be punished to the extent that that person harmed another person. Mm-hmm. It's a bit of an eye for an eye mentality. And that is one way to think about justice. But another way to think about justice is to try to think about everyone involved in the situation or affected by it and what their real needs are and where you want to see this 10 years down the line or 20 years down the line. I would never ask the victim's family or the victim of any serious crime to try to think of all the other people involved. That's something that really we have to do as a state and as people who influence what laws get made.
And I am curious, what can we be thinking about? Look, our legislature only meets every other year. There's a good chance that this topic will be coming up because of all the emotions around the cases that we've mentioned today. So what would be a good new way of looking at it, or new laws that we could have in our community that make things more right?
Perhaps I'm a person who likes to take baby steps instead of big leaps, but the first thing that I would really like to see for Nevada is I would like us to be able to know what cases get transferred and why those cases get transferred or certified, whatever you want to call it. When is the decision made that certain people will go to criminal court as opposed to juvenile court, or be returned from criminal court to juvenile court, which can also happen in some cases?
Mm-hmm.
Who is that happening to and why? Is it depending on who the DA is? Does it have anything to do with who the kids are, the courtroom, and so forth? And get a sense of how those decisions are made. And at the very least, just find a way to make that more informed by the science and informed what we know about kids.
Eve and Ann, thanks so much for joining us on CityCast Las Vegas.
Thank you, David.
And that's all for today here on CityCast Las Vegas. If you enjoyed the show, we encourage you to tell a friend. You could also rate our show wherever you listen to it, leave us a review, and subscribe to our morning newsletter. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Till then, stay lucky.
There's this huge chasm, I don't know how to say that word.
It rhymes with banana.
Okay, let me start again.
Go ahead.